Hello, everyone. I'm Shirin from Peace Vigil, the organization that is bringing you today's webinar. We are based out of Johannesburg, South Africa, and we welcome each one of you to our webinar, The New Dictators. Our speaker today is Walden Bello. Before we begin, I need to share 3 things with you. And they're very simple things. One is that you can comment or ask questions through the chat function on your screen. You have the option of writing to the whole group or to the organizers only. Second is that this is a space of learning, so no question is stupid and disagreements are natural, but we must exercise respect for each other. And lastly, if you would like to share the recording of this webinar with anyone, it will be available on our YouTube channel, which is Peace Vigil. You can see the logo there. That way you can identify what channel it is. And also we are live streaming it right now. So because we had a limit of number of participants we could include in Zoom, if you have friends who were not able to get on, please do tell them that this is being streamed live online. On the YouTube channel, Peace Vigil, very easy to remember. And it doesn't require any membership, any information, so you can just go and watch it. We also encourage you to check out our other resources besides webinars, which are drama, songs, quizzes, interviews, stories, and group exercises that explore history and the contemporary world to find knowledge that will protect and promote peace. This is a peace education organization. This webinar is part of our effort to protect and promote peace. Once again, Peace Vigil welcomes you all to this webinar, and we hope it will help us all learn more. I now request my colleague, Samir Dosani, to begin the webinar. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Shirin. So I'm just going to, can everyone see me? Can you let me know if I'm being seen? I'm not quite sure about the technical side of this.
Yes, we see.
Yes, Samir.
Fantastic, thank you so much. As Shirin says, we are Peace Vigil. We are here to really create more activists, more people who are campaigning for peace. And in order to do that, it is my pleasure to welcome Walden Bello, who I've known of Walden Bello for many, many years, but I've first met him, I think, around 2000, around the Seattle protests, or soon after that, in 1999 in the Washington, D.C. Walden became a campaigner against the Marcos dictatorship as a student in the USA. In the 1980s, he wrote a book called The Development Debacle. That book is made with documents taken from the World Bank on a fateful Thanksgiving Day, I remember, if I remember the story correctly, Walden. It proved that the World Bank was providing material support for the Marcos dictatorship, among other things. Walden started to focus on the Global South in 1995, based in Bangkok, and it has offices in the Philippines and in India. Walden has also served most recently in the Congress of the Philippines from 2009 to 2015. His most recent book is Counter-Revolution, The Global Rise of the Far Right. Currently, Walden is an adjunct professor at SUNY, the State University of New York, and a retired professor at the University of the Philippines. In terms of how the format will work, comrades, Walden will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we'll be hearing from 3 very insightful respondents. And after that, each of the respondents will have about 10 minutes. And after that, we hope to hear questions or at least comments from the audience. Let me briefly introduce the respondents as well, just so that we do not have to do that then. Tamas Gerox, forgive me for the pronunciation, I'm sure it's wrong, will be our first respondent. He's with the State University of New York, and he's joining us from Budapest in Hungary. He's an expert on the situation in Hungary. Cecilia Lero is with the University of Sao Paulo. She is an expert both on the situation from a Brazilian standpoint and from a Filipino standpoint. And last but certainly not least, we have Professor Achin Vinayak, whose latest book is called Nationalist Dangers, Secular Failings, A Compass for an Indian Left. It can be ordered from akarbooks@gmail.com. Achin is a writer and retired professor associated with Delhi University. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Walden. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Samir. And okay, so the coming to power of regimes of the far right in a number of democratic countries is one of the two big surprises of the last half century. The other being the collapse of the socialist regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989 to 1991.
I trust everyone can see the screen that's being shared.
So
Walden, you can see us.
yeah, I can see you.
So
So
go ahead.
right, just a second, please. So when the socialist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed, it was assumed that the future of the world belonged to liberal democracy. Francis Fukuyama famously declared there no longer existed a political system that could compete with liberal democracy, and this was the end of history. So next slide, please. In 2010, there were no regimes of what we might call the new far right globally, except for Hungary. Now we have seen far right personalities come to power in 4 of the 7 biggest democracies: India, United States, Brazil, and the Philippines. And even where they are not part of coalitions in power, by their electoral weight, they have in many instances moved the center of gravity of politics to the right, as in Germany, Denmark, and Italy. To take just one example, in Denmark, to be able to win the elections in 2019, the Danish Social Democratic Party adopted a hard anti-immigration stance. Next slide, please. Now, what are the factors that have propelled the far right to power or to the antechamber of power? Let us take Europe and the United States first. First, the right was able to take advantage of the negative impact of neoliberal policies on people's living conditions. Social Democrats, or the center left, were implicated in the formulation and implementation of neoliberal policies. So this left a big part of their base feeling they could no longer rely on social democratic parties to protect them, leaving them vulnerable to being pirated by other parties. Next slide. The far right, sensing an opportunity, abandoned the doctrinaire opposition to social welfare policies characteristic of the center right, and opportunistically championed some anti-neoliberal and pro-welfare state policies to win working class votes. The best example of this was Donald Trump's use of his opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership to win key Midwest states to come to power. And once he came to power, his withdrawing the United States from the TPP. Next slide. Next slide, please. Second, especially in Europe, the far right was able to harvest resentment against the European Union by riding on the democracy issue, saying that the unelected technocratic leadership of the EU was lording it over democratically elected national leaders of the member states. Thus, when in 2015, the so-called Troika disregarded the results of the Greek referendum on the austerity program it imposed on them, Marine Le Pen of the National Front in France shouted, I quote, "The choice is either democracy or Euro dictatorship," unquote. The Peace and Justice Party of Poland and Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party in Hungary have harvested a lot of support with the same battle cry. Next slide, please. Third, the extreme right-wing parties have really been able to dominate the migrant issue with little effective opposition. They have not only accused the center-right and center-left of having no viable policy on migration, but have advanced the conspiracy theory that the center-right, the center-left, and the European Union are complicit or willing dupes of what they describe as the plan to have, quote, migrant hordes, unquote, subvert European and American society. Slide, please. Now, opposition to migration and ensuring dominance of white society over minorities is a central issue the far right is riding and mobilizing on, and it is within a racist gestalt that they have positioned their opportunistic advocacy of anti-globalization, anti-neoliberal, and pro-democracy stance. Measures to safeguard and promote social welfare, save jobs, and protect the economy are all fine, they say, so long as the beneficiaries are only people of, quote, the right skin color, the right culture, and the right ethnic stock. Of course, this stance may not be stated that explicitly, but that's essentially the message that comes through. Okay, here is a quote from Marine Le Pen. Immigration is an organized replacement of our population. This threatens our very survival. We don't have the means to integrate those who are already here. The result is endless cultural conflict. Next slide, please. Let us now turn to the global south. While it is certainly true that neoliberal restructural adjustment programs contributed to worsening the already terrible conditions of existence of the vast majority of the citizens of democracies in the global south, what we saw occurring in places like the Philippines, India, and Brazil was something more fundamental, a repudiation of liberal democracy. Duterte, Modi, and Bolsonaro personified this rejection. Duterte boasts about violating due process as he presides over the extrajudicial execution of thousands. Modi glories in the fall of secular and diverse India, and Bolsonaro waxes nostalgic over the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil for 20 years. Next slide, please. Let me focus on India and the Philippines. What accounted for citizens' alienation from liberal democracy was simply the massive gap between the promise of liberal democracy and its reality. This disillusionment is perhaps best expressed by Pankaj Mishra, and I quote, "Rived by caste as well as class divisions and dominated in Bollywood as well as politics by dynasties, India is a grotesquely unequal society. Its constitution and much political rhetoric upholds the notion that all individuals are equal and possess the same right to education and job opportunities. But the everyday experience of most Indians testify to appalling violations of this principle." Next slide. A great majority of Indians forced to inhabit the vast gap between a glossy democratic ideal and a squalid undemocratic reality have long stored up deep feelings of injury, weakness, inferiority, degradation, inadequacy, and envy. This stems from defeats or humiliation suffered at the hands of those of higher status than themselves in a rigid hierarchy. The same could be said of the Philippines. The rise to power of the far right cannot be understood without taking into consideration the disillusionment of the middle class. The middle class was in the last 30 years of the 20th century a central factor in the undermining of dictatorships throughout the global south. Over the last 2 decades, however, they have been greatly disillusioned at the failure of liberal democracy to deliver on its promises and at the deterioration of their living standards. Thus, they have become open to more drastic political solutions. Some have even endorsed neoliberalism through neoliberal policies, though neoliberal policies have had contradictory effects on them. These policies eroded the conditions of life of some sectors of the middle class, but simultaneously benefited other sectors and some of the lower classes, creating what some have called the, quote, aspirational middle class, unquote, or people who are in income terms not middle class but aspire to be such. The fear of crime and the so-called dangerous classes is also a factor behind middle class mobilization towards the right. And this especially when inequality and poverty are so rampant that some people turn to drugs and crime. It is certainly the genius of Duterte, of the Philippines to take drugs and crime out of their social context and turn them into the main problems confronting all classes, rich, middle class, and the poor. There's also the powerful appeal of an anti-corruption stance, and not just to the middle class. There comes a time, however, when every party that comes to power on an anti-corruption platform becomes corrupt in power, so that people become very cynical of electoral exercises and are attracted to leaders like Modi, who they may not agree with on many points, but seem to be singularly non-corrupt. Anti-corruption was a sub-theme in Duterte's 2016 electoral campaign, which overwhelmingly focused on crime. But Duterte was seen by many as one who would bring his tough stance on crime to taming corruption, as well as disciplining a corrupt oligarchy. In office, he has reinforced his anti-corruption credentials by high-profile firings of close associates from government office. One of them, in fact, in the midst of a cabinet meeting, and this was, of course, widely dispersed in the media. The rise of the right also cannot be understood without the support of the economic elites. However, one must not fall into the false notion, common on the left, that they are merely doing the bidding of the elites. Duterte and Modi have a great deal of autonomy from them, and in the case of both, as well as Bolsonaro in Brazil, the relationship is an uneasy one. Indeed, in the case of the Philippines, the elite support of Duterte is motivated partly by fear that he might expropriate them or adopt some redistributionist policies. Indeed, he is now in the process of expropriating the powerful Lopez family. Both Duterte and Modi have power bases in civil society and government that affords them this position of strength vis-a-vis the dominant elites, though their policies do not breach the political economy of capitalism. As for the working class, the peasantry, urban and rural and urban poor, and it would be foolish to say that Duterte and Modi do not enjoy widespread support among them. I would say, however, that there is a difference in the support given to these personalities by the lower classes from that of the middle class. Borrowing from Gramsci, I would say that theirs is more of a, quote, passive consensus, unquote, while that of the middle class is more of an active consensus, unquote, manifested in the opinions articulated in television, the internet, and the print media. The middle class intelligentsia has always been an opinion maker. And in India and the Philippines, a large sector of them have supported Modi and Duterte. Next slide, please. One also cannot understand the success of some of these far-right personalities without taking into consideration their charisma. Both Duterte and Modi are charismatic individuals, although they have different types of charisma. In their case, we are witnessing a troubling relationship between charisma and democracy. I am referring to the paradox whereby free elections are resoundingly confirming their hold on power and leading to even more concentration of power in their hands. Even if people may not agree with all of their actions, they are holding their critical faculties in abeyance and identify with these dangerous personalities who announce their disdain for liberal and progressive values, for due process in the case of Duterte, and for secularism and diversity in that case of Modi. These personalities may not deliver on their promises, and their economic policies may be causing major problems like those caused by Modi's demonetization program. But no matter, they get thumping majorities. In this sense, democracy paradoxically strengthens authoritarianism. These personalities have cross-class appeal, and this is why we must consider charisma as a central reason for their success, though we on the left tend to be skeptical or even hostile to explanations based on charismatic appeal. Charisma is a social relationship between leader and the led that is subversive of reason. We must try to understand the role of charisma in history as well as contemporary politics. Otherwise, we will never understand why in the midst of the heaviest bombing in the history of war, the vast majority of the German people remained loyal to Hitler even after their Fuhrer had shot himself in the bunker. The charismatic appeal of Modi to Indians is one of the reasons that Amit Shah, Modi's second in command, has boasted that the BJP, the ruling Hindu Nationalist Party, will be in power for the next 50 years. Let me end with a few last observations. One is that a great part of the success of these dangerous personalities is their ability to scapegoat certain social groups, to concentrate popular hatred on them as the source of all of society's ills. In the case of Modi and the BJP, Muslims occupy this special place. In the case of Duterte, drug users and drug dealers. There are, of course, other groups against whom a hatred is cultivated. In the case of Duterte, yellow opposition politicians, communists, and some oligarchs. In the case of Modi and the BJP, westernized intellectuals, Marxists, and Christians. The second observation is that we would be making a big mistake to attribute the rise of these personalities to trolls. Trolls assist these people come to power and help them to consolidate their power, but mainly by reinforcing popular attitudes already partial to them. My sense is that by far the majority of pro-Duterte posts on the net is made by true believers, not trolls. From my own personal experience, some 75% of the pro-Duterte responses on my posts critical of the president received on Facebook are made by people who are true believers, not trolls. Third, there are some actors whose intervention has been critical to the success of these far-right personalities. One is an old actor in Indian politics, the disciplined radical Hindu nationalist organization RSS, whose roots go back to the early 20th century and which was greatly influenced by fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. Another is a relatively new decisive actor in Brazilian politics, the non-Catholic evangelicals that played such an important role in Bolsonaro's election in 2018. I will end here, and for my thoughts on how we can counter the rise of the right, I will reserve my questions for the question and answer period. And here are instructions on how to obtain this PowerPoint. And again, everybody, I'm terribly sorry for the problems we had in the beginning, but we solved them, and let's get on with the discussion. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Walden. Before we begin to analyze what Walden has shared with us and begin to discuss it, let me just invite Tamas, because we've talked a bit about the Philippines, we've talked a tiny little bit about Brazil, we've talked about India, but Tamas, it would be good to get your perspective on what's been going on in Hungary. So I will put myself on mute and turn my video off and leave you about 10 minutes, Tamas, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is the voice clear?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the invitation, and I am very happy and grateful to be able to participate in this discussion. Very briefly, I would make probably a few methodological comments based on our research in Hungary with my fellow colleagues at the Working Group for Public Sociology Helyzet. It's a collaborative work that I'm presenting here in a brief summary. And then I'll make maybe one or two historical references to Hungary, how we apply our methodology. So the methodology we use in a nutshell is more political economy, international political economy, and we are interested in world economic forces, which we call in a way external forces, how they interact into internal social dynamics, and obviously how internal social dynamics reintegrate themselves into the larger structure of the world economy. So this is a kind of a conjuncture of external and internal forces, their interaction, and that's the point of view from where we approach or historical questions and researches. And the kind of concepts we still use here in terms of the larger structure is following the Gramscian tradition, a neo-Gramscian tradition, if you like. It's the question of the global hegemony, what's happening on the global sphere, in the global structure, with which various social groups, various locals and states are interacting, and the starting point here is of course historical. So we'll see a decline of a hegemonic system, of a hegemonic order that's been built up in the post-war period, and that has entered into a crisis in around the 1970s. So that's on the global sphere. But what is interesting is, of course, in Hungary, we live in a very particular location, which we tend to put into a kind of a core, periphery, semi-periphery relationality. So maybe this is already a comment on Professor Bello's division between the global north and the south. I would highlight that there's something global east, we might call that, or semi-periphery, as we tend to call it, that has its specific way of articulating its class and social antagonisms and crises. What is interesting in the semi-periphery that we've observed through our historical inquiry is that, despite the fact there is this phenomenon of a global hegemonic crisis, it doesn't necessarily and directly translate into a local crisis. In fact, periodically, in certain historical temporality, we see the constellation of new hegemonic systems, local hegemonic systems, within the larger confines of a global hegemonic crisis. This is partly the result of what you may know and call as uneven development. And this is what we would use as a point of departure here, that as a result of a deeper and larger crisis, we still see the kind of consolidations or constellation of a new hegemonic order in Hungary in particular, or in Eastern Europe region-wide. What we are also very interested in this is, as I said, that the kind of not only the ideological or political surface, but what lays beneath in the social structures. So let me a little bit focus on that, and I think I'll quickly turn into the type of historical analysis we do in Hungary, and which we've already written various drafts. So I'm also very happy to share with you if any of you are interested on our findings and observations. So as I mentioned, this crisis can be traced back at least as far as the 1970s, which occurred in state socialism as well. We see a various rearrangement, political and economic rearrangement in Eastern European state socialism that put many of these states, and particularly Hungary was very exposed into an early neoliberal track, I have to call it. And despite the fact it was still a state socialist political hegemony under somewhat Soviet control, we see a growing reliance on external funding, Western external funding, a deeper integration into various trade relations, surprisingly not only with the West, but also with the global South. And there's this phenomenon of a rising indebtedness for various reasons that I don't have really the time to go into the detail of it. So this is a long culmination of what we might call a neoliberal accumulation regime that's been really starting in the late 1970s, and that takes throughout the 1990s. And as you may see, there's been a political change in the meantime from the end of state socialism, the collapse of state socialism, into an explicit and outright liberal, in fact, a shock therapy-like neoliberal era up until the early 2000s in the case of Hungary. One of the important point I really want to emphasize and raise here is that despite the fact we talk about in reality, some of these processes, structural processes lying beneath the structure of world economic structures, been really going on for some time now. And if you like, it was a political culmination of a much longer history of demise. As of the neoliberal regime of accumulation, of course, it's a very complex regime itself, whether you look at its ideological surface or the kind of a class composition that arose, as I mentioned already, from the 1980s, 1970s, 80s onwards. What I would highlight here, and in some of the papers we drafted, you can read about it, is the so-called intercapitalist class struggle that emerged within this regime, and which is somewhat very peculiar to much of the experience in other semi-peripheral regions, let it be Latin America or Southern Asia. So in this regime, we see the rise of what I would schematically call a comprador elite, a comprador class who's been closely tied to international capital, mostly financial capital, and partly it's been also tied to international industrial capital, particularly German electronic and industrial capital that's been expanding eastwards from the early mid-1990s onwards. And this is again another story. I will not have the time to go into the details of it, but you see the global crisis of industry, of manufacturing, and one way of reorganizing industry, as we all might know, is relocating large segments of low-paid, low-value-added segments of industry to peripheral, semi-peripheral locations. So Eastern Europe is becoming highly exposed to that in relation to German industrial capital. So this is the kind of legacy, in fact, of state socialist crisis and the new type of integration into the type of international division of labor, particularly its European version within the EU that you experienced in Eastern Europe from the 1990s onwards. And again, for various reasons that I have not much time to elaborate on, we'll see the fragile nature of this accumulation regime and the dominance of the comprador elite that enters into crisis from the 2000s onwards. Its most visible manifestation was the rising debt level, not only public but private debt, and its even heavier reliance of external credit. And so the whole sort of a regime entered into a debt spiral and a debt crisis even before the world economic crisis in 2008. And what we encountered in Hungary during the global crisis was a massive collapse of that particular regime and that type of economic system that built up throughout the 90s onwards. I see I have just one more minute to conclude, and again, maybe it's just the larger framework I had the chance to explain to you. But what you experience from 2010 onwards, with Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his ruling Fidesz party entering into the politics, is the reorganization of this intercapitalist class alliance on behalf of what I call the national bourgeoisie, so various domestic fractions of different capitalist ruling classes, and through ideological means, whereas various industrial trade policy means, they renegotiate an otherwise still highly subordinated position of domestic capitalist classes with the larger international capitalist classes, mostly with the German industrial capital, as well as their attempt to diversify their room for geopolitical maneuvering with new sources of finance capital. And here it's important to stress the rising role of Chinese and Russian finance capital in this new international class alliance that you experience in Eastern Europe. So probably, yes, it's time for me to end this somewhat methodological, somewhat historical drafting of the problem. As I've mentioned, I'll be very happy to share or papers with you where we explain it in a much more detail.
It's really fascinating, Tamás. Thank you so much. So it's really interesting to get into the history even before 1989, and how Hungary was already almost preparing for this, the question of which kind of capitalist the political system would align itself with has been alive for like 3-4 decades. So it's a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure we'll return to it. But for now, can I ask Cecilia, please, to share your insights? Cecilia, we've heard a tiny little bit about Brazil. Walden, of course, is talking more about the Philippines, but if you'd like to add on the Philippine story as well, please do. So please, Cecilia, you have about 10 minutes.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Good morning, well, good morning for me. So I jotted down a few points while Walden was talking that have to do with both the Brazilian as well as the Philippine experiences and how they work in comparison with each other. So something that Walden mentioned and that he and I have spoken about quite a bit is this idea of middle-class disillusionment. And I think this is something that we can see very strongly in both the Philippines and Brazil. The thing we have to remember about this, the aspirational middle class, is that the nature of capitalist development in the global South in the past couple of decades has been one where you have seen large numbers of people leave poverty, but enter a sort of precarious middle class, a lower middle class, wherein their incomes are not guaranteed. We've seen it happen in conjunction with the weakening of unions. And so this adds to it. There's a multiplier effect with the precariousness that they feel. And I have a paper out now that argues that this precariousness, this tendency that the middle class, especially the new middle classes, have towards supporting these new dictatorships can be seen especially along 4 lines. So these new middle classes are really have their identities built on consumerism, this idea that social mobility is based on how much you can buy, and especially connected to what Tamás was saying, especially with credit. So it's even more insecure because the extension of cheap credit fuels consumerism that then puts families into debt traps. The increased role of travel, so people are traveling to especially countries in the first world and then seeing being more frustrated with the lack of basic services in their own country. The new middle class paying taxes, and so expecting more that their governments are not able or are unwilling to deliver in terms of good services. And of course, feeling detached from policies that target the poorest of the poor, but also the extreme wealth growth they see on the highest levels of the income spectrum. And this, especially in Brazil, has to go hand in hand with the lie that the capitalist system is a meritocratic one. And that's something that Bolsonaro and his whole ideological part of his ruling coalition has really harped on. And that gets into both the role of identity and the role of crime, and how, rather the role of how these new dictators are able to weaponize and multiply, even invent the fear of crime in order to create this other class in society. So Walden spoke a bit about the role of identity in the global north and how the far right is championing, especially the role of whites over minorities. And as we were speaking this morning, I found it very interesting how Duterte, Bolsonaro, as well as Modi have really used, weaponized the idea of the identity in their own way. Bolsonaro's probably is the one that has done it in the way that is close to the global north, by valuing a whiteness over the diversity that is Brazil. And it's especially ironic because whites are the minority in Brazil. Brazil is a place where over 50% of the population identifies as Afro-descendant. And Duterte has also used it to focus on or cultivate anger against Manila, and he's really stoked sort of Visayan, so identity of people coming from the middle and the south of the country against the Manila elite. And Modi, of course, is really weaponized as well Hindu identity. But in addition to these sort of ethnic or regionalist identities, I think it's really important to look at, Walden said, how they have weaponized crime. And this is especially important and especially dangerous in both the Philippines and Brazil. And it also harps to the failure of the liberal democratic regimes to deal with the real, the fact that crime has actually existed quite plainly in these countries, and the assumption that that economic growth would just deal with crime, as opposed to actually going in and understanding the root causes of crime and how so much of it is related to the lack of an effective state. So you have sort of ignoring crime and assuming that economic growth will magically fix it. At the same time, the widespread acceptance of mass incarceration and a security system or criminal justice system that focuses overwhelmingly on punitive measures. And we can go into the historical reasons, the kinds of deals that had to be made in the transition to democracy, the deals that had to be made with security forces to basically maintain any sort of stability in those countries. On the point of elite support, I think Walden is absolutely right that at least in the Philippines and Brazil, elite support is functional more than ideological. So it's really interesting that in both countries, neither Duterte nor Bolsonaro was the first choice of the economic elite of finance capital. In Brazil, they wanted Alckmin, who was the former governor of Sao Paulo, to win. However, in both cases, and in the Philippines, they would have been perfectly happy with Mar Rojas. In both cases, we saw a popular, sort of this popular bandwagon on their candidacies. And then, I mean, capital goes with who they think is the winner and who they think they can control. Here in Brazil, very similar to Duterte, Bolsonaro said from the beginning, I don't know anything about economics, but I believe in capitalism because I hate communism. That was the extent of his economic ideology. The concession, or I'm not sure if I should call it a concession or a carrot to finance capital to support him, was the appointment of Guedes as economic minister, who is Chicago boy, the most liberal, more liberal than Milton Friedman, because Milton Friedman at least supports a basic universal basic income. And so appointing Guedes was Bolsonaro's signal to finance capital that I'll be on your side. You have someone in your camp, from your camp in my camp. What's interesting now is that Guedes has no idea how to deal with the COVID crisis. As you've probably seen, Brazil is having one of the worst responses to the COVID crisis. Cases are still rising every day, and Bolsonaro doesn't believe that like COVID is a thing. He's putting immense pressure on the governors and mayors to open. Here in Sao Paulo, things are halfway open, even though we have not reached any sort of plateau. And Bolsonaro has actually tried to hide the number. He's ordered the federal ministry to stop reporting the number of COVID deaths. And so we have governors and mayors trying to report them. Some political scientists here are wondering, are hypothesizing, especially Fernando Limongi, that finance capital will stop supporting Guedes because he has no idea what to do with the economy except to force people to go back to work, which is going to result in a lot of people dying, unfortunately. On charisma, I think charisma is a really important point, but we have to remember it or think about it in conjunction, how it was paired with planned and prolonged attacks against the immediately preceding regimes, and attacks that equated the immediately preceding regimes with liberal democracy in general. So Duterte, as Walden said, really focused on creating an enemy out of the yellows, out of the Aquino supporters. And what you see is that people, Duterte supporters attack democracy in general as if the Aquinos were in charge of the entire liberal democratic regimes, as if they were not, their family was not just two presidents out of, I forget how many. The same thing with Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro never would have won without people's hatred of the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT, which was also a prolonged attack since the early 2010s, at least. In media, in Brazil, there's a media monopoly. There's one company that has 90% of market share. And in the Philippines, we also saw this Marcos-focused historical revisionism attacking democracy and equating Aquino with democracy since at least 2009. Just to close for my final point, not to get too conspiratorial, but we also have to remember that these guys all interact. So we see really clear and really obvious co-strategizing between the Bolsonaro regime and the Trump regime. There was a CPAC conference here not a few months ago. Bannon was here right before the election. We know Cambridge Analytica has been both here and in the Philippines. So there's a front. These are not isolated incidents just borne out by the way that capital has developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Very insightful comments. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll return to some of them. But for now, may I please ask Professor Achin Vinayak to give us a few comments.
Yes. Hello, Samir. And let me say it's always a pleasure to listen to Walden. Yeah. Can you? Yeah. Yeah, it's a pleasure to always listen to Walden. I benefited a lot from what Cecilia and Thomas had to say. We're dealing with a phenomenon which is global, in which case our first principle of explanation has itself to be somewhat global. And what can that be? And the answer is actually very simple. It's a rise of neoliberal economic globalization. I agree with Thomas, in fact, that this process of the shift towards neoliberal economic globalization really begins from the late 70s, early 80s. And what do we see from that period onwards? We see everywhere the rise of what has been called the politics of cultural exclusivism, taking the form of either race, ethnicity, religion, nation, separately or in some combination. And when it's in combination, of course, it combines with the question of the nation. So you had irredentist nationalisms related to the breakup of Soviet Union and ex-Yugoslavia. You have the rise of racist, anti-immigrant xenophobia, even in the 80s and onwards in Europe and in the advanced world. And of course, you had the rise of all kinds of exclusivism of religion religious exclusivism everywhere, and so on. The important point to understand about neoliberal economic globalization is that we should understand it not as a set of policies, but as a general direction. A direction related to the question of financialization and the greater importance economically of the market, not the decline of the state, but the reorganization of the state and the re-regulation of the state. Now, you're talking about capitalist neoliberal globalization, but this is taking place in a world of multiple nation states. And the interesting thing about what we call authoritarian populisms, whether in Brazil or the Philippines or Hungary or France or India or anywhere else, is please note that the common form of all of these authoritarian populisms is an authoritarian nationalism. The question then becomes why? Why is it that it's an authoritarian nationalism? And I would suggest that the most important reasons for this is because of the importance of nationalism and the nation state, both from above as well as from below. What I mean from above is that you cannot have the stabilization of neoliberal economics in any particular country without having the stabilization of a far-right, right-wing politics and ideology. And what that means is that even as we start from the question of neoliberal globalization and assess why this has taken place, how it's taken place, and so on, there is no substitute in order for us to understand these different right-wing and far-right authoritarian populisms. There is no substitute for nationally specific analysis as to why this has happened. And this differs in important details, even as they have commonalities in all of these different countries. So I think that's very, very important. We can't get away from that. They have taken place in electoral democracies. This neoliberalism automatically represents an erosion of democratic rights in many ways and so on. All that is taking place. Fine. So nationally specific processes and understandings. Now let me come to the Indian context. I won't go into a detail historically as how it's developed, but I will say that among all the far right forces in the world, the far right force of what we call the BJP and the RSS, which is the parent body of what is called the Sangh family of associations, is by far the most powerful and enduring. It is distinct from all other far right forces in the following way. It is the only one that has a continuous existence of over 90 years. This is not the case with the rise of Bolsonaro or Duterte, Le Pen or Fidesz, Orban or others. A continuous existence of over 90 years. Second, its implantation in the pores of Indian civil society is incomparable. It is incredibly deep. Fortunately, India is a continent, which means that, of course, even though it is very considerably deep, India is, of course, much wider, and that gives you a source of resistance. But which other organization has millions of cadres, has 4 pan-national Indian bodies, has 36 affiliate organizations, has over 800 NGOs associated with it, has the largest private network of schools, and I can go on and on about so many aspects here. No other force compares with it. It's also the one which has the most remarkable social cohesion, in the sense that of all the parties since 1947 in India, the BJP and its earlier forerunner, what was called the Jan Sangh, this is the only party in India which has never suffered a serious split. The left has suffered splits, the Congress party has suffered splits, others and all, but not the BJP and the Jan Sangh. And finally, I would say that it also has a much weaker collective opposition. I'm not sure I think from what Walden has been saying about Duterte are also fairly weak. But but do they all have the same solidity of support, not just as president, but even in the houses of parliament? Because today, the BJP has a majority in both houses and is able to transform the legal foundations of Indian politics and suborn the various institutions of the state and so on, and even in civil society in a way which is quite dangerous and extremely dangerous. So, I mean, this, if you like, is an important distinction, I think, between the Sangh BJP are the weak spots. With regard to the question of, I'm sorry, on the question of hegemony, I said authoritarian nationalisms. Why the importance of nationalism? In fact, nationalism is a belonging or a community which is even more powerful than that of religion. From top, the importance of nationalism is because you need the nation state, even for the ruling class, for economic purposes of stabilization, and very importantly, for political purposes, to police the losers, because of course in neoliberalism you have much greater winners and losers and inequalities of various kinds. And also from below, because whether the nation state is still the most important political unit to which people have a sense of belonging and connection. And the reason for this is that even in non-democracies, the nation state is a state that is supposed to belong to the people. This is something different from past states in the sense that two principles of nationalism are extremely powerful. One is the fact that the important concept in the nation state is the citizen, and the citizen is supposed to be technically equal. Everybody is a citizen. The other aspect, of course, is that the government of a nation state, even if it's a dictatorship, is not supposed to be accountable to some ruling family or whatever. It's supposed to be accountable to the people, constituted as separate nations. Now, what's happened with neoliberal globalization is that it has created, of course, erosion of democracy. It has also created a great psychic disorientation. And I think Frederick Jameson made this point very effectively when he said that what's happened through this capitalist neoliberal globalization is that the time-space coordinates of ordinary person's lived experience is no longer capable of making that person understand what's going on, understanding all the forces that shape its life. Because now so many things completely connected shape their lives which they cannot get a handle onto. And this creates, of course, a psychic disorientation and instability, which facilitates the question of looking for some kind of a scapegoat to understand what is happening. And here, of course, the question of all these authoritarian nationalists come in. They always point to some particular category which is the enemy without. And that enemy can, of course, vary from nation state to nation state. So this indeed is something that also facilitates. Now, the question of charisma, before I come to what I think we will have to do in India and what's here, is that, yes, charisma is something that's important in the past. Walden has emphasized its importance. But in contemporary times, something else is also, a number of other things have facilitated this question of charisma. One is the policy convergence between the main competitors, political parties that compete for power, electorally speaking, and so on. When there is such a policy convergence, then it's not surprising that there will be more of a focus on individuals or persons or leaders and all who will bring about some kind of a change. Second aspect I pointed out is the complexity of the forces that shape one's life and so on. A third aspect, if you like, is also the question of what can be called the mediatization of politics. The mediatization of politics is also connected to the visualization of politics. It's connected to the fact that television, rather than the mass meeting or working people getting together in their own clubs and others and discussing politics and so on, becomes more and more important. And this too promotes this question of the personalization of politics. So mediatization connected to personalization of politics here. With regard to the question of charisma in the Indian context here, this may be specific to India, but please note that Modi certainly has a lot of popularity when it comes to national level issues. But also notice that when we talk about elections that have taken place at the state level, then you find that the same voters who vote for Modi and the BJP at the national elections vote for alternative parties because they're much more concerned about down-to-earth livelihood problems and the functioning of the state governments. And therefore, you found that Modi's charisma and personality doesn't operate as effectively at the state level as it does at the national level. Indians love to talk, so I'm going to keep myself short and come to a swift conclusion. What are the weak points here in the Indian context, in case we want to fight against, in order for us to fight against that? Number one, jobs related to the damage of neoliberal economics. Number two, the question of health. Here, given COVID, the importance of moving towards a public, universally cheap and effective and quality-based public healthcare system is very, very important. And one must push for that. And you can be sure that the neoliberal ruling classes and others do not want it. But this is something that can appeal to everybody, even if they are supporters of Modi and so on. Welfare. In the Indian context specifically, the question of caste. And finally, yes, the question of democratic rights and liberties of various kinds. This continues to be an important terrain and so on, of fighting here. So these are the terrains on which we'll have to fight. Now the question is, who is going to fight? And what are the strategic actors? And we have to make a distinction between tactical activities and the strategic opponents. It should be clear, I think, from what all three of us have been, all four of us, Walden, Cecilia, Thomas, and myself have been saying, is that you are not going to effectively fight against these far-right forces, effectively meaning in an enduring way, get rid of them, without attacking neoliberal economic globalization. Neoliberalism has to be there. Then the question becomes, what other political parties in these different countries are prepared to fight against neoliberalism? And when I say fight against it, I'm not talking about simply having a softer or harder version of neoliberalism. Who is going to fight to transform that? And the idea that you can resort back to some kind of social democratic Keynesianism is over. The relationship of forces between labor and capital have shifted dramatically. Neoliberal capitalism is a new form of capital accumulation as compared to the old Keynesian type. And therefore, in a certain sense, yes, we have to talk about here. Here, I will simply say that in the Indian context, I believe, at least, that we will have to build a new left with a transformative vision of its larger vision, which means that you are not simply, because what the BJP does is give it a transformative vision about a new India, how we can build a new and more dramatic India. We have to counter it with our own, and if we fight on the weak spots that I've said, and we have to fight against neoliberalism, then it automatically means a much larger collective vision, and we have to bring the question of socialism. Sense, if we are successful in fighting against neoliberalism, yeah, I'll stop now. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I really don't want to cut because I know you have a lot of wisdom to share, but unfortunately we do have some questions that are coming in at the same time. I just want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to at least make their voice heard. We won't have time to sort of enable everyone's microphone, but I just wanted to read a couple of the questions that have come in. One question that's come in is actually for you, Achinji, so just stay on, which is, why do you think the Hindu right has been able to continue for so long? Along with that question, there's another comment that's related from Dr. Islam. Dr. Shamsul Islam says, I'd like to add that the rise of neo-fascism under Modi is the fulfillment of an old Hindutva project, older than the rise of neoliberal politics. Manusmriti would be the constitution. Manusmriti is the oldest fascist document which treats Shudras, lowest caste, and women as subhuman creatures. Yeah, those are the two comments and questions maybe that you can respond to before we go back to Walden.
Okay, very quickly. The first question I think was about why has Hindutva been able to succeed in this respect here? One, very quickly, its implantation in civil society has been the most important factor. We have the ups and downs electorally of the BJP, this thing here. Plus, let's also understand the shift that has taken place in the major alternative bourgeois forces towards this year. Here, if you like, the comparison is between England, UK, the US, and India. You have the rise of a far-right force in the late 70s, early 80s in all these three countries, right? You have in the UK and in the US a fight against Reaganism and Democratic Party, which is lost. And after that is lost, you have New Labour and New Democrats, which have actually conceded ground to Reaganism and Thatcherism. And in India, you had, in fact, the Congress Party shifting towards neoliberalism even before the correct, and pointing out that Manusmriti and others have provided many of the important ideological sources for this far-right politics. In fact, I'll just end by saying two things, and that is that the Nazi concept of Aryanness and the Nazi symbol of the swastika were both in many ways decisively influenced by the laws of Manusmriti and ancient texts which Hindutva has made central to its politics.
Right, and on this, I will refer people to a couple of things. So one is that we have an earlier webinar called COVID and Neoliberalism, or Neoliberalism in the Time of COVID, I think. So people can go back on our YouTube channel and talk and learn more about the connections between those things. And we also have a video essay from 2018 called The Indian Origins of Nazi Racism. I would encourage people to go on our YouTube channel and check that out. Walden, can I ask you to make an intervention responding to the questions that have come up on the chat box that you may have seen, as well as what you've heard from our respondents. Please, Walden.
Okay, well, just a couple of points. First of all, thank you to Tamas, Achin, and Cecilia on a very insightful contributions, and this is a real very interesting both intellectual and political engagement that we're having right now. Just a couple of points. One is I definitely agree with Achin that one of the things that you don't have with other right-wing regimes at this point is the sort of very old and deep penetration of the RSS, which was founded, I believe, by Chin back in 1925 and has been greatly influenced by fascism and Nazism and has had this continuous existence, and it provides the fundamental organizational base for the Hindu syndicate, to put it that way, including the BJP, that and this is what differentiates, one of the things that differentiate India from the other instances of the right wing coming to power. The second thing that I would just like to add here is, yes, I agree that with these regimes right now, we have both a deepening of neoliberal globalization, but also, a kind of diversifying kind of process that is affected by the national situation, as Achin has said. So we need to really see how this global neoliberal capitalist process is interacting with the nation state and with the culture and with the specific politics of each country. And I would just like to say here that for any regime of accumulation, you have two things happening. One is, of course, the accumulation or the increase in profitability. That is one function. The other thing is that you have a legitimacy issue, that a regime of accumulation is always very fragile in the sense that it has to appear legitimate to those that are being exploited. And it is this contradiction that creates this diversity. For instance, as we have seen with, for instance, in Europe and in the United States, you don't have pure neoliberal programs that are being advanced by this right-wing populists. They, in fact, have adopted a number of the points being advanced by the left, and put them, of course, within their own gestalt, which is a right-wing gestalt. So many of these things that they have picked up from the left, they put it together and say, yes, these are good things. These are social measures. These are good measures, for people, but only for the right people with the right skin, with the right culture, with the right ethnic stock. So that's the way they put it together, and then they create this process of othering in which they make the minorities and migrants the focus of popular anger. So this is sort of a process that is, taking place. The third thing that I would just like to comment on at this stage is with respect to the question of charisma. I do definitely agree with Chin's point about the role of the mediatization, which has replaced the local political meeting and has expanded the possibilities, therefore, for charismatic individuals, especially when you don't have any real policy differences anymore, because both Congress in India and the BJP and Modi are both essentially neoliberals. So it becomes a kind of differentiation by personality. What I would say, though, and emphasize here is not to underestimate this factor of charisma, because it enables people like Duterte and Modi to have this cross-class appeal. Now, people might wonder, why do I think Duterte is charismatic? Well, there are different kinds of charisma. You have the Modi inspirational type, and then you have this type of Duterte, which is a kind of a gangster charm. But it's a gangster charm that basically says, hey, the only person that can rule the Philippines and bring order is a gangster like me. Okay, so unless we understand that there is this charismatic element, we can't understand why this guy has 87-90% popular support. Okay, and basically what we're having right now in a number of these countries is that people, despite their differences with some of these dangerous personalities, are willing to, in fact, withhold their critical faculties, give these guys the benefit of the doubt, and then vote for them. And then I come to this very, very problematic process whereby electoral democracy becomes a means via charisma of enhancing authoritarian power or an authoritarian direction. So democracy and authoritarianism are supposed to be contradictory. But here, in the case of both Modi and in the case of Duterte, you have a synergy between authoritarianism and democracy. So let me just put those points out there now. And as to how we confront it, I'll just leave that for the latter part of this discussion. I have about 5 points that I'd like to share later, but let's move on.
Great, thanks. So just a warning, folks, we had advertised this as an hour and a half, but I think we're going to go more like 2 hours. So just a warning that I think that's the tenor of the discussion. There are great questions coming in. Please keep them coming in. I would like to use the facilitator's privilege and just give a little bit of my own analysis, if I may. So just to say that, I mean, I think when we're talking about these things, my feeling sometimes is that we get caught up in how we used to see the world 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I think that that's right. I think our analysis of the world at those times was correct for those times. But when we see shifts happening, when we see even world systems perhaps beginning to crack and to break, I wonder if it makes sense to take a sort of even a longer view of history. So I've had the opportunity, now I've been studying, many of you don't know, I've started to do a PhD over the last couple of years. And what I discovered in doing this PhD is that about 0.7% of people globally, so less than 1%, and this is at almost every national level, this is certainly at a global level, the richest 0.7% of the global population controls the vast majority of resources. And this number 0.7%, it just sort of kept chiming in my head. And I looked at history, I looked at feudal systems prior to colonialism, prior to the 15th century, the mid 15th century in Europe. And I found that the number of landholders in Europe in the 15th century, so I'm talking about 1450, prior to the first colonial expeditions, was 0.7%. I found that the number of people given titles in England prior to that, so 1200 we're talking about, was about 0.7%. So if you have, and if you have a situation where the structures, the system is there explicitly so that a very small minority of the population can control everything. But at the same time, you have these movements that started, whatever starting point you want to begin with. The Europeans will start with the French Revolution. I think we can start with the immediate resistance to colonization that happened in Haiti, that happened in places like Brazil, that happened in Africa. It happened immediately, right? People asserting their democratic rights. So you have this tendency, it's a human tendency towards democracy, and you have the system, this Eurocentric system, which is designed, and it's a political, economic, it's even a familial system, which is designed for the rule of a very, very small elite. How do you do that? And what I'm coming to the conclusion is that actually fascism, or whatever you want to call it, some kind of gangsterism, some kind of fascism, some kind of very hierarchicalized, casteist, racist system is actually the only way that can work. Because 0.7% of the population is not enough to control people physically. It's not enough to control people, that's not an army, right? But it could create an ideology that will then, and neoliberalism is part of that. Neoliberalism is how you suck the wealth up to the top. But you need something beyond that. Neoliberalism has its limits. And in my analysis, what we're coming up against are the limits of neoliberalism. So with that said, let me just share the screen for the recent, the things that we've just been mentioning. So one is this video that we've done, the Indian Origins of Nazi Racism. This is available on YouTube, as I say, youtube.com/c/peacevigil. And this is the more recent webinar we've done, COVID-19 and the economy, going deeper on this question of neoliberalism and so on. Let me go back to the comments and the questions. I saw that Adnan had a question. Adnan is writing from Pakistan. Adnan is saying, is the far right in India engineered effort, or is it a sociological evolution of the society? Millet has a question. What is the new normal for this breed of dictatorships, given that the pandemic has hugely exposed the systemic flaw in the neoliberal policies and people's welfare? There's a question from Anvesh, is asking from Paris. Is it fair to say, borrowing from Walden's immediate point, that the policies of the far right try to emulate socialist policies for the social class of people they politically champion? In that case, are they trying to build a socialist system with existing class distinctions for smaller group of citizens? Adnan has another question, the subsequent connection with Trump, but in the States, the evolution seems to be over fast jumps suddenly from Obama to Trump. I have my own opinions on that, but maybe I will throw this first to Cecilia. Would you mind responding to some of this, or would you like to enter the conversation?
Hi, sure. I'll just address two of the questions. So for Millet about the new normal, I think the new normal really depends on politics. It really depends on the popularity of the new authoritarian president and the way that power is structured in society. So we see, for example, that Duterte, where even among COVID, amidst COVID, he's been able to maintain high levels of popularity, at least perceived popularity according to the surveys. He's been able to use COVID to further restrict democracy, to pass through the draconian laws, to bring the military onto the streets. Here in Brazil, it's been, I think, the president's popularity has declined so much in COVID. In addition to that, his just erraticism has caused so much chaos that his ability to do anything to further the authoritarian project is really limited. And then in Trump, we see something sort of in the middle where there was this attempt to bring the military onto the streets in the wake of Black Lives Matter, but civil society was sufficiently organized in order to combat that. And so I think it's hard to say there is a new normal, but we see the attempt to use the crisis to strengthen authoritarian moves, and that is mediated by society. And then in response to Adnan, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but one thing I wanted to bring up is that, so in these, the three countries that I know about the best, Philippines, Brazil, and the US, we see these authoritarian populists come to power after really popular presidents, right? So Obama left, I don't remember quite what his approval ratings, but they were quite high. Lula had over 50% approval, and Noynoy Aquino also had over 50% approval once they left. And so in that sense, it really is a puzzle how someone so polar opposite was able to, not even polar opposite, but someone who presented themselves as representing the polar opposite was able to come to power after. And so I think this has to do with it really points out something in these three political systems about how minorities are able to really game the election system, right? So even though in all three countries, you know, they all won the vote democratically and legitimately, but Trump won with, because of the electoral college, was with less than half the vote. Duterte also won with a 39% plurality. And Bolsonaro in Brazil, there's a 2-round system. And so he also won, and a huge number of people left their votes blank. And so he also won with technically a plurality, but not a majority of all voters. And so I think this idea of sort of backlash, and especially this anti-systemic backlash against what too many sectors were probably celebrating as progress, says something about how the bases of these authoritarian populists can be energized.
Thanks so much, Cecilia. Tomas, can I ask you to enter the conversation?
Yes, I would like to make a short comment on one of the questions that's been raised by Professor Bello, which is the deepening of neoliberal globalization and how it interacts differently or at a different historical conjuncture with the quote-unquote nation state, and it produces different policies of the nation state. And of course, we see the process of fascism or fascistizations in many of these states we discuss here, but even we may add on a global level of a kind of a global apartheid with the control of various access to citizenships. And so what I would like to highlight here in my comment is that one of these notions of, these neo-fascist states act in a way as if they have stolen some of the agendas that's been advanced or asked by the left, and how could that happen? And I think one way to look at it is really, again, through the sort of class composition and class antagonism that appears throughout the process of fascization. So what we see here in Eastern Europe, in Hungary in particular, is that's been very much on the agenda. So many of the so-called leftist agendas, like, if you like, anti-systemic or anti-colonial rhetorics or ideology has been captured by the far-right government. But what is interesting here is, of course, that they speak on behalf of their fellow national bourgeoisie, the national bourgeois group, which they portray in their form of representation as of a dominated class on the global scale, and they advocate for some sort of antagonism with the international fractions of capital. So this is a way how they steal agenda, but of course it's important to highlight maybe two things here, that this is obviously not a revolutionary but a counter-revolutionary position, since it intervenes in an inter-capitalist antagonism and not the sort of relations of production. It's not advocating workers or other dominated or subordinated groups, but it's advocating for a particular fraction or a particular class or alliance of classes of capitalist groups. And the other point I think is important here to highlight in relation to this fascist process or fascism as a result of actually deepening neoliberal or globalization is that some of us have also mentioned here, that there is this phenomena of the centralization of capital. Probably, Samir, it was you who mentioned it, that this is, of course, a long history, and we have many accounts on that, and it goes back as far as of Marx's observations, how the crisis of capitalism is pushing through the monopolization and centralization of capital, which actually deepens antagonism within the capitalist classes themselves. So what fascist states tend to do is that they mediate between these antagonistic capitalist forces, typically monopole capital and various fractions of, if you like, petit bourgeoisie or segments of national capitalist classes. And that's exactly what I think we see, at least in Hungary, in terms of this neo-fascization of the state. And this is what explains some of its ideological differences and its policy differences compared to a previous stage of neoliberalism.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. This has been a really interesting discussion, but I want to move us slightly. Achin, I'll come to you next. But before I come to you, I just want to move us slightly to the question about, what comes next. And I think to frame that, we've seen prior to the COVID outbreak, we saw protests led largely by Muslim women across India in a way that we hadn't seen before. We've seen protests for racial justice even after COVID, even now in the last few weeks in the US, which has spawned some similar protests, I know, here in South Africa and other places as well, anti-racism protests and so on. But as yet, I think, as we're all saying, as many of our panelists have said, the political parties don't really represent genuine alternatives. These protest movements, on the other hand, seem to be having some success, or at least some momentum. Achin, how do you see what do you? I guess it's two questions. If you can play a little bit of fortune teller, I know that that's not something we like to do, but what do you see happening? But more importantly, I think for us as people who are, we may be intellectuals, but we're certainly all activists here. What should we be doing? Who should we be aligning ourselves? How can we help to make things better? How can we help to get these dictators out of power?
Yeah, okay. Sami, am I heard?
You are heard but not seen. Let me see if I can turn your video on.
Start my video. I've started that.
Great, thank you.
Is that okay?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Yeah, well, to take your, perhaps I can address the question by Adnan first and then come to yours. Is that okay?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. Adnan asked about the question of whether it's engineered effort or a sociological evolution. Well, the two are connected in the sense that obviously it's the kind of processes and the activities of the RSS and the Sangh family syndicate that is responsible for the change. But of course, they have been trying to do what they've been doing for a long time. But the reason why they've had much greater success is also because circumstances have changed, the failures of other forces in society, which connects to Samis, including the failure of the left. Yeah. The point I want to make, especially about India, is that when we are talking about this far-right force, this is a force that is actually expanding its hegemony. And when we talk about hegemony, we must understand how you actually establish a kind of hegemony. You do it by doing three things. You become the principal arbiter, even as you promote ruling class interests. You become the principal arbiter for the intra-ruling class tensions and differences. Second, you have solid support from what's been called the petty bourgeoisie or the middle class. And here Walden made an important point when he said that there is active consensus from the middle class and there is a passive consensus from those lower down. This ideological support coming from the middle class, which is squeezed between the bottom and the top, is a very important fact. And the third aspect, of course, is when through a combination of sticks and carrots, you are able to control and manipulate the lower classes. Now, insofar as the lower classes and the upper classes have all sorts of tensions between them, a force which is able to hegemonize successfully has to mask and unify all three of these categories. And the most important source for it to mask and unify, as Gramsci pointed out, is the establishment of a new kind of national popular will. The question of nationalism becomes crucial. Your particular formula, construction of particular kind of nationalism for masking and unifying, you can unify by making a scapegoat and so on. That, in a certain sense, is what the BJP has successfully been able to do, the BJP and the Sangh. I would suggest to a stronger level than in the other countries, which means that there's going to be a longer time span for us to, in India, to be able to successfully fight to defeat that, which comes to, if you like, Samir's point here. We have to make a distinction between tactical alliances and strategic, that is to say, strategic actors and tactical alliances, people that you can connect with on this particular issue, which can be the opposition parties, because we have to recognize the difference between all the other pro-capitalist parties and this far-right force. And therefore, that means that there are occasions in which you will have tactical alliances with them. You also have in a country like India, because it's such a huge country, all kinds of progressive movements of different kinds. You mentioned, of course, this struggle against the Citizen Amendment Act by Muslim women in particular. And let's not forget that one of the most positive developments out of that anti-CAA stir and movement was that youth, college-going youth across religious faiths also came in support of this. And that's a very positive development about young people who have lived in India, democratic society, and have democratic values of various kinds. The crucial question there is, how do you link all these progressive movements and struggles together? And that's, of course, an organizational question as well as a political question. Do you do it through some kind of network or networks, or do you do it to try to build some kind of party formation, and so on. And that's a longer term issue. The third aspect I mentioned, the question of caste, which is very important. I personally believe that as a strategic actor, you have to build a newer kind of a left, which will come from these various political force movements, which will come from sections of the existing left and so on. And you have to have a larger transformative vision, which is the basis on which you can organizationally connect. So what do I see in the future in India? I see turmoil. I see all kinds of struggles taking place. I don't see a fundamental display influence of Hindutva, even if there is a Congress or other coalition government that comes to power, which then won't really last long. And it's an open question about what we can do. There are many crucial issues. This ecological crisis is going to create a kind of fortress of the BJP and Sangh are going to be screwed in a very serious manner. Now, this creates the possibility that they will also recognize that we have to fight against these forces and so on. It's an open question. It's really what we do. I can't really honestly say more than that. I am saying that the time span for fighting them is possibly, this I would leave to Tamas and Cecilia and Walden, will possibly be longer, because I see this Sangh as more entrenched than perhaps Duterte or Bolsonaro or Orban. But and then I might be wrong.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Etan. With that, may I turn back to you, Walden, and your 5 points that you promised us as not quite the last word, but the almost last word here.
Yeah, let me just, okay, can you hear me now? Okay, Samir, just a few points to address before I move on to the 5 points. And I'll ask you to flash them when I'm done. You know, first of all, in terms of the situation in India, I think Achin is definitely right. It's going to take some time. And I think we must be very worried when Amit Shah, the second in command behind Modi, said that the BJP, he was very confident, he predicted that the BJP will rule India for the next 50 years. So let's take that as a warning, and you know what is really up, what we're up against in terms of the situation in India. The second thing I would just like to address is with respect to the situation in Brazil and the Philippines before the Bolsonaro and Duterte came to power. One element I think that we need to seriously consider is, although a lot of the corruption charges against Lula and the Workers' Party were frame-ups and really engineered by the elite, there was nevertheless some truth in the fact that there was some corruption that in fact had taken place in different parts of the government. Although, as one Brazilian activist said, they made it seem like we invented corruption. But there was that element. Now, the problem, I think, in India, in Brazil, was that precisely because the Workers' Party had come to power on an anti-corruption platform, that it went back up to 2002, very strong anti-corruption. When certain parts of the party then begin to display corrupt tendencies, the judgment is all the greater. Like, for instance, the bourgeois parties would, if they engage in corruption, they would say that's expected. But when the Workers' Party engages, or some parts of it are found to be corrupt, then the fall and the disappointment is greater. So I think that must be factored in. With respect to the Philippines, Aquino, I think his popularity at the end was more derived from his mother and father, because as Warson Arguelles has pointed out here, by the end of the Aquino government, you really had, you know, in terms of living standards crisis, you know, they were very rife at this point in time. And of course, Duterte's genius, as I said, was to come as a one-issue person. And he said, yes, it's all because of criminals and drugs. And that's how he won the elections. But there was a lot of existing discontent on so many aspects that his image of being the guy who could fix it, he was able to project, you know, that image. So can you just flash my last points there? Okay, some thoughts on how to counter the far right. There's actually a 6th point, but you know, I wasn't able to do that. But one is, we need to stop resorting to easy explanations about the rise of the far right, like that it's trolls responsible for it, and acknowledge that far right personalities and movements have a critical mass support. And indeed, in the case of India and the Philippines, a big majority support. The second, we should find ways of stopping the extreme right from coming to power in the first place, like building broad united electoral fronts, even with non-fascist groups we may now have differences with. It's so much harder to remove the far right once they're in power, precisely because they will use being elected democratically, in fact, to gradually, in fact, and brazenly, in other cases, de-democratize the country. The third is make sure that we have the leading edge of our resistance, those movements which have a great deal of resonance among broad sectors of the population, like the movements to stop climate change, promote gender equality, and advance racial justice. These are very resonant movements. We really need to make sure that they're on the forefront of our movements. Fourth, we need to fiercely defend human rights and democratic values, even where, or especially where, they have become unpopular. This will involve aggressively championing people and groups that are currently persecuted. Now, this generation may well be compromised, and I'm talking about the Philippines at this point, but our resistance and defense of these values will be an example to the coming generation and will play a role in turning things around. And I think we really are in this struggle for the long haul, so don't expect any quick victories. And the best thing that we can do at this point in time is really to stand on our values and principles. Fifth, let's not fear to see what we can learn from the extreme right, especially when it comes to the politics of passion or the politics of charisma. And we need to see how our values can be advanced or promoted even in passionate and charismatic ways. I know that we on the left have a tendency to be very rational in the way we approach things and to be suspicious of passion and charisma, but I don't think they're really that contradictory. We must unite reason to passion and not see them as being in contradiction. And the most important thing, I was not able to hold on, is that what Achin has said, we really must have a transformative vision, that can compete and eventually become hegemonic. And that vision at this point in time, is something really will have to be one of radical equality, and real, genuine empowerment. There is no going back to the discredited liberal democracy that these authoritarians have so successfully, are tearing apart. But we really need to have a deeper and more democratic and real democratic vision to be able to advance and win over people. And like Tamas, Tamas and Cecilia and Achin, I'm quite confident, that we can eventually triumph in the end. Thank you. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Walden. And thanks to all of our speakers, actually. Let me just take a moment to thank not just our speakers, but all of our attendees. We've had great turnout for this event. I really want to thank everyone who was able to come. This has been a fascinating discussion, and it will continue. I was very impressed with all of our panelists, and I'm sure we'll have many of you back on to have a longer conversation, or else we do a series. We do different kinds of videos, so we may have some of you on just to warn you to be on our podcast or something like that. With that, let me turn it over to Shirin to have the last word.
I would like to thank Walden Bello for an amazing talk, and I think I myself learned a lot, and I'm sure that other people, all the people who attended, learned a lot as well. I would also like to thank Achin Vinayak, who was, you know, I mean, all the insights he gave on India are amazing. Cecilia, I learned a lot from you. Thank you. And so did everybody else, I'm sure. And also Tamas, thank you so much for joining and explaining a lot of stuff. I know we didn't have enough time. Perhaps we can do a more detailed interview with all of you. And in the end, I would just like to wrap by saying that what Walden Bello said about challenging the right before it actually gets into power is very important. From the perspective of peace education, I would say that that is the main aim of any activist working in a society, whether in a small community or on a larger scale nationally or internationally, is that the right wing has to be stopped before it gets into power. Because as Walden says, once they are in power, it's much harder to get rid of them. So I would encourage everyone on this webinar, and also later on when you go back to your communities, to understand that challenging the right wing, challenging these these kind of people like Modi and Duterte is very important before they get into power. Of course, now they are in power, so the struggle is more difficult. But let us not let more people of that kind get into power. And just to remind everyone that this was recorded and was also live streamed. It is still being live streamed, so it is on YouTube if you want to watch it again. As Walden said, his PPT is available. He gave information there on how to get it. If you have any more questions or concerns, please do write to us. We can pass on your questions to the panelists. And please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is very easy to remember, Peace Vigil. This is a voluntary organization. There's no paid staff in this organization. So everything that we do is a labor of love, and we can't do it without you. So please do subscribe. It's a free subscription. Also go to our Facebook page and write reviews and give us 5 stars if you can. Yeah, thank you very much for joining, and do watch out for our next webinar, which most likely will be on the Ghadar movement. That was an international movement in support of India's struggle against the colonial power of Britain. And our guest would be Bhagat Singh's nephew, Dr. Jagmohan Singh, in that. We will keep you posted about the details. Thank you once again, Walden, Cecilia, Achin, Tamas, and everyone who attended this webinar. Peace be with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.